Hi. So my thesis topic is on Indigenous women's spirituality in Indonesia and in Canada. And I have pages and pages, so I'll just run through as much as I can in 20 minutes. And I probably won't get through it all. My proposed thesis topic is comparing literature projects that will explore dialogue around Indigenous identity in literary works by Indonesian and Indigenous Canadian authors, emphasizing the voices of female authors and the role of women in literature. And I am particularly interested in the role of women's spiritualities in establishing Indigenous identity and maintaining Indigenous connection to traditional culture. I will argue that representations of Indigenous women's spiritualities in literature reflect regionally specific concerns and affect ways of identifying that accomplish, deliberately or otherwise, varied and specific agendas. I will use the term spirituality and spiritualities in this thesis to refer to forms of spirituality particularly significant in the establishment of Indigenous cultural identity. These forms are often and not exclusively non-institutional religious beliefs, Indigenous religions, and beliefs, or highly adapted and regionally specific forms of institutional religions. Spirituality can function as an empowering marker of identity. Knowledge of the traditions, practices, and worldviews that accompany spirituality entails recognition of locality, ancestry, and social context. Indigenous identity can be articulated through assertions of Indigenous spirituality as a connecting and mobilizing force toward recognition of Indigenous communities in order to undermine the imposition of colonial forced identities upon Indigenous peoples. I've chosen the term Voudou women in the title of this essay to describe representations of Indigenous women's spirituality in literature because of the ways that, both because of the romantic history of the term Voudou in popular consciousness and because of the empowering possibilities evoked by reclaiming the name in an effort to gain acknowledgement of the legitimacy of spiritual practices that the term Voudou has been used to describe. Ultimately, I hope to bring greater attention through this work to the need for strong and challenging representations of Indigenous women for the purpose of healing Indigenous communities and dismantling the hegemonic ways of thinking about Indigenous peoples that are perpetrated in political and economic spheres. Joanne Episconou states in reference to Indigenous self-representation in literature that through literature it is possible to, and I'm quoting, construct a common truth about our shared past. Her statement can be applied to the colonization of Indigenous peoples in Canada, to the global interventions of world powers with developing nation states, and to all situations and circumstances that result in the oppression of peoples and the suppression of their voices and telling of their histories. This topic will allow me to address the following problems: the absence of affirming criteria for Indigenous identification in Indonesia, specifically the problem of cultural appropriation and subsumation of regional identities in Indonesia, issues of Indigenous cultural representation in Canada, issues of Indigenous identification within a contemporary global context. And I'm going to quote from Clifford: if people in the Pacific have occupied large spaces with canoes, why can't they, as Indigenous peoples, dwell with airplanes and the web? This is a common problem in Indigenous identity and defining that within a contemporary context. And of course, possibilities for the exchange of strategies of representation amongst Indigenous communities. My emphasis on Indigenous women's spiritualities in relation to land and locality will enable a framework for discussion of Indigenous identity from a women-centered and regionally specific perspective. So as methodology, I will apply variously contemporary political analysis, including reference to works by Jonathan Friedman, Gayatri Spivak, and her discussion of subalternity and positioning of the critic, and Franz Fanon's concept of the post-colonial. I feel that the works of these authors generate appropriate frameworks within which to position discussions of oppressed and marginalized peoples and communities. For close reading analysis, I will draw from the ideas about literature and text introduced by Roland Barthes and Jacques Derrida. Derrida's post-structural theory of analysis and Barthes' transitional exposition between structural and post-structural analysis provide opportunities to challenge the dominant narratives that drive a text by dismantling the reader's assumptions regarding the meaning and significance that is being conveyed. These methodologies will enable me to critically address the complex social and political environment that enables varied readings of each work, and I will position these representations within contemporary political and social political context. I hope to discuss the possible implications of different approaches to indigeneity as identity, given the existing concerns of Indigenous communities. Jonathan Friedman provides an assessment of traditionalism and ethnic mobilization within the context of modernity by associating these with movements for local autonomy. Friedman's theoretical approach is significant to discussions surrounding the cultural assertion of Indigenous identity in relation to issues specific to region, locality, and community. Spirituality, often a designator of identity, is also directly linked to locality in many instances. I'll frame this discussion through an additional lens, privileging women's voices and roles in literature and considering the importance of women to Indigenous communities and the significance of Indigenous women's roles in developing Indigenous identities within a contemporary global context. Andrea Smith draws parallels between the exploitation, sexual violence, and demeaning of Indigenous women and the colonial appropriation of land resources. I will formulate my argument to demonstrate the relation between Indigenous women, spirituality, and land as a means to locate my argument within regional contexts. So I have prepared a sample analysis of two of the texts that I potentially will incorporate into my final thesis. One is N.H. Deeney's The Keeper of the Temples, and I compared that with Yvette Nolan's play, Job's Wife, or The Delivery of Grace. N.H. Deeney is a female writer from Java, and her short story, The Keeper of the Temples, was published in the Indonesian journal Budaya Jaya under the title Penanggung Jawab Chardi in 1973, and again in English in Menagerie in 1993. N.H. Deeney was born as Nurhayati Sri Hardini Siti Dwi in Semarang, Central Java in 1936, and her works were first published in 1956. She often addresses themes of traditional Javanese culture within a colonial and modern context, and the impact that these shifting worlds have on traditional society. So I'll discuss her story first. The Keeper of the Temples is a short story about the influx of colonial practice into a Southeast Asian community. Based on reference to Batamang and the connection to French administration, the country where the native people reside in the story is most likely Cambodia. And the story details the foreigner's role as guardian of the local temples and illustrates the disparity of interest between the colonial administrator and the local residents and their culture. Several of the themes that arise in the narrative are of particular interest. One is the theme of gender relations between the colonial administrator and the Indigenous women. This has particular significance as it is demonstrative of the oppressive outlook of the colonial administrator who objectifies and others the local women. Quoting from the story, their relationship outside the bedroom was to be that of master and servant. The relationship between Indigenous women and the colonial male is reminiscent of Gayatri Spivak's statement, white men are saving brown women from brown men. The colonial administrator is able to exoticize, exploit, and dehumanize because, I'm quoting again, what was important to them was to have a life that was a little better than their countrymen. They could dress up, put on makeup, eat more than enough. The woman is encouraged to accept material gain at the expense of connection with cultural heritage and community. Also of particular significance is the representation of Indigenous worldview and spirituality in the form of the temple that is guarded at the gate by two lions. The temple demonstrates the formidable architectural skills and religious conviction of the Indigenous community, but like the housekeepers, is submitted to the authority of the colonial administrator who takes advantage of the temple's relaxed atmosphere and provision of support in order to continue with his leisurely lifestyle. I'm quoting again, who wouldn't envy a life like his, especially since he'd done almost no good work and exerted no effort to achieve it. The temple is, of course, associated with land, often discussed in relation to references to nature. And it is possible to draw from Friedman's association between nature and primordial culture in culture, identity, and world process. When drawing the connection between the natural environment and the place where, quoting, the king's ancestors were worshipped. The story illustrates the parallel between the exploitation of women and the exploitation of land by colonial oppressors, and shows the way that colonial practices of exploitation of indigenous women and disregard for spiritual tradition systematically dismantle the pillars of culture and community that ensure respectful use of land and natural resources. Overall, Keeper of the Temples illustrates the degree of disdain with which the colonial administrator treats the host country, displaying a lack of work ethics towards preserving local cultural heritage in the form of the temple, as well as a lack of respect for the local population and world views. The colonial interest is fully exposed at the end of the story when the colonial administrator resolves the problem of the design flaw in a restored temple gate lion. The design flaw is the fault of the administrator's own poor drafting skills and a source of humiliation for him in full view of the indigenous working population. No one dared utter a word, although all present recognized the mistake. The solution is that the administrator brutally responds by ordering that the head of the lion, quote, be smashed down to the line that he had drawn. Speaking to the ruthlessness of the decision-making that serves colonial interests in maintaining power. And, of course, portraying the position of the keeper of the temples as exploiting rather than preserving, maintaining, and caring for indigenous culture. And just to tie up a little bit, I won't have time to get into Yvette Nolan's play. But I can say that overall, that provides, the story represents, there may be a parallel between the oppression of the colonial administration in the story and the fact that the story is written during the New Order period, representing strategies that enable the abuse of power by fascist institutional authorities. Keeper of the Temple shows the subsumed, subaltern voice in the exploited indigenous worker population and the servant women. And illustrates the tensions that exist between indigenous peoples and colonial institutions and the way that the position of women is indicative of the degree of suppression of the subaltern voice as a result of that tension.